Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the presentation on harmonizing 27001 with U.S. regulations. My name is Carl Carpenter, and I'll be your speaker today. Earlier in testing, there was a little bit of a lag between switching slides, so I will try to maybe pause a little bit in between switching slides. If I go too fast, feel free to let me know, and the moderators will also let me know. Our agenda for today, we're going to talk about my company, Arrakis Consulting, a little bit about myself, what is some upcoming Arrakis Consulting training, what is 27001, and why do we like 27001, some U.S. regulations and frameworks to consider. We won't go into a lot of detail on U.S. frameworks and regulations, but we will mention some of them that are of extreme importance to a company that cares about security or privacy. Possible steps to harmonize 27001 and some framework comparisons at a high level, extremely high level. We're not going to talk about all the frameworks. Each one could be its own week-long course if we really wanted to dig into it, and there's a lot of them. And then we'll continue on our agenda with quick wins. We'll briefly discuss risk assessments, third-party involvement with companies in relation to 27001 and harmonizing security model or security frameworks. Definitely talk about maturity models in relation to other frameworks, but not necessarily 27001. And then also understanding risk as it relates to non-compliance, possibly not with 27001, but with other frameworks, but with a 27001 flair to it, and some of the concerns that should be considered. Again, if I'm going too fast, feel free to tell me to slow down or whatever in the chat. So about Arrakis Consulting, Arrakis is a full-service cybersecurity company that helps clients get compliant or stay compliant with whatever regulatory environment that they're in. Arrakis essentially doesn't care whether it's HIPAA, PCI, FERPA, COPPA, CMMC, GDPR, CCPA, we don't care. We'll work with the clients in whatever regulation that they're required to be compliant in. We also help companies get certified in a variety of certifications at the company level. So currently 27001 is the most popular certification that companies are going for. Right after that, I would say SOC 2 for US-based companies. We're finding more and more requests for CMMC and FedRAMP, and those are primarily based around Department of Defense for US-based companies, well, not US-based companies, but for companies that have involvement with the US Department of Defense. And not to toot our own horn, but currently we have a 100% pass rate for our customers that are seeking company-level certifications. So again, if a company wanted to be 27001 certified, we have a 100% pass rate in that, which is awesome. Occasionally, we also act as a second opinion to some audit firms if they have areas of concern or want an independent decision or suggestion or comment. This is not necessarily rare, but it does happen every once in a while where a company will, an audit company will want us to review something to make sure that they are accurate in their assumptions or comments or decisions. Arrakis also offers multiple managed services, 23 currently, with the whole idea is to reduce time and effort for client companies that want to get certified in something or they have to be regulatory compliant. Our clients find that they love this really because it reduces time and effort on their part. And we all know that companies like to do things at the very last minute and wonder why it's not done fast enough. So this is one of the options to help make them happy with waiting to the last minute to do things. And out of those services, we also offer several services that are that are not necessarily popular from the managed service side, such as privilege access management, data loss protection, and so on. But there's other services that are fairly generic that other managed service companies offer, such as patching or antivirus or whatever. The difference between a lot of managed services that are offered by other companies and ours is that Arrakis understands the why and why those managed services need to be offered as in relation to the regulatory environment that they're in. So Arrakis is also composed of highly experienced and certified consultants that handle numerous frameworks. Most have held positions of all levels of leadership and are comfortable interacting with leaders at any level in the company or the client organization. About myself, I'm retired military of 23 years. I'm a commercial pilot and skydiver. I'm the former CISO for a $6 billion entity where I was responsible for 15,000 employees and roughly 2 million end user customers. And as a part of that experience, going into it, I was thinking I would probably only deal with cybersecurity issues and everything else that wouldn't really have anything to do with what I was really doing. Unfortunately, I was involved in numerous investigative cases involving homicide, corporate espionage, things like that, much more than I ever thought I would get into. I hold around 46 certifications, ranging from privacy, security, audit, penetration testing, networking in general, standard IT things, and so on. I've taught multiple different subject areas in relation to technology such as Microsoft or Cisco. I've taught CCIEs to be CCIEs. I'm also a 27001 senior lead auditor and instructor, 27005 lead risk manager and instructor, certified data protection officer and instructor, and some other areas that I've got my instructor rating in. So Arrakis is also offering upcoming training. If anyone's interested, there's the email address down at the bottom that you can email if you choose to. We're offering 27001 lead auditor training in May, risk manager in June, cybersecurity manager in July, data protection officer in August, and CMMC foundations in September. And again, if anyone's interested, feel free to reach out to the email, or you can notify put something in the chat and they can notify me. All right, enough about me or Arrakis. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to discuss today about 27001 and how to harmonize it. So if you're not familiar with 27001, maybe you are, maybe you're not. It's an international framework that is accepted across most countries on the planet. We really like this as cybersecurity professionals or audit professionals or consultants because it's a consistent framework. It helps companies in Belgium, for example, have the same level of compliance with a company in Texas. 27001 is not generally a required framework for any sort of privacy model or cybersecurity model or anything like that. It's generally not required, but it's quite often mentioned in contracts between companies. So if a company wants to hire another company and there's some security concerns, one of the things that they'll ask for is a 27001 certificate to show that the company is compliant. And that's, in a lot of cases, not only is it for a security posture reason, but it's also for cybersecurity insurance reasons to protect the receiving company, the client company. The current version of 27001, the 2022 version, is designed to align better with GDPR. And if you're aligning with GDPR, it's important to note that other regulatory environments will most likely be aligned with in an easier manner. That doesn't mean that 27001 is a solution to solve all problems, but aligning with particular privacy regulations does help companies, not only in the space of GDPR, but also in the other privacy regulations that you will find in the United States. So why do we like 27001? Real simple. It's an easy to implement framework. It's not difficult. It's fairly straightforward. It does, however, require some commitment from the client company that is going to implement 27001. And we'll go over some of those risks in later slides. Generally, it's suggested that a client that's intending to get 27001 certified should actually have some sort of third-party external guidance to help that company be more efficient, save money, and so on. Arrakis has run across a few companies that tried to do this on their own with the assumption that they knew what they were doing, and it doesn't work out. It just costs companies more money. There's also generalized requirements. So, for example, 27001 says you have to have an anti-malware solution, but it doesn't say what kind of anti-malware solution. So we have generalized requirements across the board, regardless of where the company's at or what type of company it is, what vertical the company's in. So that really makes it a lot easier for companies to become certified, auditors to audit, and certifying bodies to certify if we have these generalized requirements that meet the needs of the regulation, the certification, and the company itself. It also allows for an easier understanding of a company's security posture. So one of the functions that Arrakis performs is vendor due diligence from the cybersecurity or information security standpoint. When we get an ISO 27001 certificate, we understand that that company has achieved at least 27001 status, which gives us an understanding of the security posture of the company. That doesn't mean that the company could do more than what 27001 requires, but it does allow an easier understanding of the company's security posture, how they handle security, some of their functions, things like that. Additionally, it increases or improves confidence in the certificate itself. This is easy to figure out. If you have consistent standards, then the people that are doing the auditing, they're going to be certified, they're going to be accredited, the certifying bodies are going to be accredited. Everybody has the same standards, again, regardless of what country you're in, what the company does, things like that. So because we have a consistent set of standards, the confidence in the certificate applies across the globe, across the planet. However, there is significant overlap with other frameworks, and we'll talk about some of them. I'll give you some examples. Where 27001 can merge into another framework easier, and if, let's say, for example, I was to say NIST 853, but NIST 853 doesn't necessarily merge into 27001 easier. So 27001 in a nutshell can go into other frameworks in an easier manner than most other frameworks can go into 27001. Yes, so let's talk about some US regulations and frameworks. Again, just some, not all, because there are numerous frameworks that we would care about. So starting with the top, we have some privacy-related frameworks, CCPA. CCPA is basically California's version of GDPR. It's very similar. There are some minor differences to CCPA and GDPR. There are also other states that have followed along with what California has done with their state-level version, state-level privacy framework, to create their own. Obviously, I'm not going to list them all here because there's only so much space in one slide you can have. But CCPA from the US standpoint in relation to GDPR, CCPA is the one that pops to mind mostly. We have HIPAA. I'm sure everybody in the call knows what HIPAA is. That's medical. FERPA, that's education-related data. CAPA, which is basically children's protection online, things like that. And again, there are others. We also have government-related regulations. CMMC, that's one that's really popular right now. That's for the Department of Defense. NIST 853, there's multiple versions of that. The latest one is version 5 or release 5. That's kind of the backbone of all the government regulations that are out there. And of course, you see where I put etc. because NIST has a lot of regulations. Then we have some financial regulations, so FFIEC, so that's for the banking industry, and that's an offshoot of NIST 853. IRS Pub 1075, that's for companies that deal with federal tax information. That's also an offshoot of NIST 853. So you can see a trend. The government likes NIST 853. There's also another one, NIST 171, which is what CMMC is based on. But you can see a trend that a lot of the US related regulations are based on NIST 853. So if you're not familiar with NIST 853 and you do intend to harmonize 27001 with 853, my suggestion would be to download it and start reading. If you have trouble sleeping at night, this is what you could read and go to sleep faster. We also have other financial regulations that are not necessarily a regulation or a law. The one in particular is PCI for credit cards. That is basically a grouping of banks that created the payment card industry that have their own set of regulations and so on. So we have financial for like federally regulated stuff like banking or federal taxpayer information, but then we have other financially related regulations that could apply. There's also others in general, not really sure why I didn't list any, but they're there, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. There's numerous regulatory agencies that deal with all of these regulations up at the top that I mentioned. So for example, if we're going to talk about federal tax information, the regulatory agency would be the IRS. FFIEC, that could be the IRS depending on the engagement. But there are other areas of regulatory agencies that could come into play. I mentioned the Federal Trade Commission, though. This is the one that concerns me the most for client companies or any company in general that operates, does business, or has US-based customers. So why does that concern me the most? In my opinion, and only my opinion, the Federal Trade Commission is one of those entities that has the ability to regulate in any possible direction with no clear understanding of what that direction should be. So for example, if I was in the banking industry, I would know I would have to comply with FFIEC. However, other industries not in the banking industry, if they're investigated by the Federal Trade Commission, then the Federal Trade Commission themselves could say, you should be complying with this regulation or that regulation, but there would be no indication in advance of knowing what regulation to comply with. So consulting companies such as Arrakis can help out in this area. The other reason the Federal Trade Commission concerns me the most is because there is a Data Privacy Act that has been considered for quite some time inside the United States. And I call it ADAPA, the American Data Privacy Protection Act, but it's basically the US version of GDPR. And why I'm concerned about that from the framework harmonizing standpoint is currently the Federal Trade Commission is going to be the regulatory body that monitors the US version of GDPR. So if we have a regulatory body that's going to monitor basically the US version of GDPR, but there's no clear understanding from the Federal Trade Commission of what should be done to protect the company from possible violations, and the Federal Trade Commission has the option of coming in and making a determination as they see fit, then that seems to be kind of a minefield of some sort for companies. So let's get into some possible steps to harmonize. So first off, I would suggest do a framework comparison. Figure out what frameworks you have to be beholden to. So is it GDPR? Is it 27001? Is it CMMC? Is it FFIEC? Figure out everything in relation to what framework you need to understand, and then understand the differences. However, also understand that 27,000 series does not necessarily integrate with other frameworks, or 27,000 series does not necessarily cover all the requirements that other frameworks may have. So there's definitely going to be some gaps in relation to a framework comparison. So we'll, in later slides, we'll do an example of this. You also want to establish your quick wins. Why do you want to establish your quick wins? Well, because you want to move that ball down the field a little bit farther and as fast as possible, especially if you're in a possible situation where you or your company could be sanctioned. You don't ever want to be sanctioned. So if you can show progress as soon as possible, then you want to do that. So that's quick wins. You really want to do a risk assessment, and you want to do this risk assessment in a variety of different ways. You want to do it based on 27001 and then other frameworks, and we'll talk about that again. All right, and then the next slide for harmonizing, or possible steps to consider in harmonizing. Get a third party to perform an independent audit. You always want to do that because it allows a client company to understand exactly what a third party would see if they came in and reviewed it themselves. Naturally, we would suggest if you get an independent party to perform an independent audit, or a third party to perform an independent audit, we would suggest you do non-disclosures and so on. You also want to understand maturity models, and we have some slides to look at that. And then understand the possible risks to a company for non-compliance, and we'll go over some of these in greater detail, but there are legal issues that could come up, both civil and criminal. You want to avoid the criminal issues at all costs, and then some financial risks due to non-compliance. So here is a framework comparison. So when we look at, and this is a giant spreadsheet. If I was to display this whole spreadsheet on the screen, it would be like 9 feet wide. So I just had to put in a portion of it. But each column represents a framework. And then far over on the left that you can't see because it's simply not there, would be the requirements, like have a password, have antivirus, have data loss protection, privileged access management, things like that. So one of the things that I do for a framework comparison is I pull up this spreadsheet and I'll highlight a column. So for example, this is where my mouse is. This is ISO 27001 version 2022. I'll highlight this whole column. And then over here is NIST 853. I'll highlight that whole column. And anywhere there is an overlap with a square that is populated with something. So here we have PM1, and over here we have a whole bunch of stuff. If it's highlighted, then there is a similarity between the two frameworks. However, if there's a square that is populated in one column but not the other column, then that is a difference between the two frameworks. And I do not remember where I got this giant spreadsheet at. I want to say it was like 8 years, well, it can't be 8 years ago because it's 2022 in here, but you could probably find it on Google. Obviously, I have taken the spreadsheet and improved it with time, but this is one way you can start doing a framework comparison. Doing this will allow you to start establishing quick wins. And again, you want to do quick wins as soon as possible in order to get the ball rolling down the field as faster, and maybe at less effort or cost. Additionally, most GRC tools, and when I say GRC tools, I'm talking about RSA Archer, Aptega, talk about Logic, Vanta, Drata, things like that. All of those tools can help you understand framework comparisons in an easier manner. Certainly, it's much more expensive than looking at an Excel spreadsheet, but if you want to truly harmonize 27001 with other frameworks, then you're going to want to have a GRC tool of some sort to help you. Be very careful on what GRC tool you pick. Some are more expensive than others. Some require, like RSA Archer. My personal opinion, RSA Archer requires a special unicorn in order to make it work, because you have to have Archer trained people if you want it to truly function the way you'd like to function. So continuing on with framework comparison, and you can see the differences now. If we look at 27001 and we do a word search for the word authentication, it's mentioned 5 times. 27002, authentication is mentioned 4 times. But then when we get to 853, the word authentication is mentioned 259 times. This should be a clear indication that some frameworks are different than others and have a different set of priorities to them. This is also why, if you're going to implement 27001 and some other framework, I suggest strongly that you become intimately familiar with 853, because if you're going to harmonize something, you understand 853, you're going to understand some other 800 series frameworks as well, such as maybe 800-171. Then if we look at COBIT 5, the word authentication is only mentioned 2 times. So you can see different frameworks have different levels of priority based on what they view as important. Obviously, the word authentication is important to me. That's why I picked it. If somebody's going to break through and have access to something, authentication is going to be one of the ways they're going to do it. So let's look at quick wins. And these are quick wins regardless of the framework. It could be in any subject area. I just have some listed below, but that doesn't mean that these are only the quick wins that are out there. So first off, we have antivirus. Every framework is going to require some sort of anti-malware solution. But not every framework is going to be as specific as other frameworks. So for example, 27001 says you have to have some sort of anti-malware, antivirus solution. But it doesn't say exactly what kind of anti-malware, antivirus solution that you should have. There might be some other AV solutions that you might want. However, if you're going to implement antivirus in the United States, if you're not familiar already, the United States government banned Kaspersky for government use within the United States because Kaspersky has ties to the Russian FSB. So if you are harmonizing 27001 with anything else and it was inside the United States and you had an issue with of any sort, then and you were using Kaspersky, there's a high probability that your cyber insurance would not be sufficient. They would probably deny you because you should have known better. Additionally, some cybersecurity frameworks require, in relation to antivirus and anti-malware, might require a virus definition update of at least 24 hours. 27001 doesn't require that. They just require updated definitions. So there is a difference in 27001 requirements and other regulatory environments. Awareness training, similar concept. Every regulatory environment is going to require awareness training of some sort. 27001 requires awareness training, and they also require phishing training, but they don't necessarily say they require good training. So technically, if you look at the 27001 frameworks, 27001 framework, you could have very bad awareness training and still pass because you have an attendance roster. There's a bunch of different things. but other frameworks might have much more stringent awareness training required from the client company. So you may have to establish a quick win of really just using a good awareness training. If anybody's interested or curious, KnowBe4 is a really good training company. They are awesome. Similarly, patching is required for all regulatory environments. If you're not familiar with it, memorize these words. Patching must be done within 30 days of vendor release and after testing. 27001 requires patching to be done, but they don't necessarily require a specific timeline the way it's written. However, other regulatory environments require patching to be done within a specific timeline. Additionally, they require patching to be done based on the criticality of the patch. So for example, if there was a vulnerability of some sort and a patch was released and it was viewed as critical, you might be required to have that done within 7 days as opposed to 30. Logging is another issue that's required across all regulatory environments. Logging is, everybody should know what logging is if you're on the call, but basically logging user and device activity, things like that. Every regulatory requirement requires logging. However, some regulatory requirements require monitoring of the logs. 27001 certainly does require monitoring, but so do some of the other ones. The difference is that 27001 doesn't necessarily say the frequency of logging, whereas some of the other models do require more of a sufficient logging frequency as well as documentation of that logging. Here we have policy, standards, and procedures. All regulatory environments are going to require that. So these, again, are all quick wins. Most policies for 27001 and standards for 27001 are going to, in most cases, align with most regulatory environments. However, there might be some cases where some minor wording changes to those policies in order to better align with a different framework. Again, in relation, comparing NIST to ISO 27001, NIST has more stringent requirements, in my opinion. So an ISO 27001 policy may be sufficient, but it also may not. So you would have to understand what possible minor wording would need to come into play in order to be fully adapted. And then just so everybody's familiar with administrative controls and technical controls and managerial controls and so on, policy, standards, and procedures are your foundation for any regulatory environment. If you don't have policy, standards, and procedures in place, but you do have technology in place, but no underlying reason of why that technology is in place, there's going to be an issue for that company. Procedures are very similar to policies and standards. So policies are the law of the company. The standards are, to what level of, like say, encryption, AES 256 or something. Procedures are how you do things within the company. ISO 27001 doesn't necessarily require good procedures, just that you have them. And that's an extreme difference when you look at a regulatory environment like CMMC, where not only the procedures have to be good, they have to be accurate, and they also have to be in a position where somebody who's not used to running the procedure could pick the procedure up and naturally go through it as if there's no problems at all. 27001 doesn't require that level of detail. So again, 27001 procedures are a lot easier to deal with than a lot of other regulatory environments. All right, moving into risk assessments. Arrakis, we suggest an initial risk assessment, obviously, and frequent risk assessments through time. 27001 requires a risk assessment at least once a year. While that may be good, we suggest what we call rolling risk assessments. So as risk changes, you're adjusting the risk assessment instead of waiting till the end of the year to do it. I've never understood why risk assessments should only be performed once a year by regulation or by 27001 standards in comparison to when risk actually presents itself and the remediation of that risk. So we suggest rolling risk assessments. This also helps companies if an auditor or certifying body or an investigator comes in and says, when was your last risk assessment? You can legitimately say, we do rolling risk assessments. It was last week or last month. You know, you don't have to say we only do them once a year. We do them as needed. Obviously, at least once a year, though. You want to perform a risk assessment when you're looking at risk and other frameworks. You want to perform a risk assessment based on 27001 specifically. Then you want to perform a risk assessment based on whatever other framework you're looking at. And in most cases, it's probably going to be some derivative of 853. Then you want to consider other factors of that risk assessment. So for example, 27001 is concerned about environmental factors. If you're in California, you should consider the factors of earthquake or PG&E knocking out the gas, or maybe a wildfire or something like that. Add in all of these, do all these risk assessments that are external to the framework itself to get a clearer understanding of not only do you understand what the 27001 framework has in relation to risk, but the other framework, as well as possible external factors that are not included in either one of those frameworks. A popular risk that I suggest our clients always consider is employee turnover. Are your employees being paid enough in order to even stay? How often do employees turn over? That's a risk, especially when you come to critical positions like the chief financial officer, or maybe some other critical position like the senior network engineer when you only have one. So continuing on with the risk assessment, once you've done those three types of risk assessments and combine them all to determine the actual risk to a company and possibly the path of least resistance and least effort, which again will help you with your quick wins. Regardless of how you do risk or what you do with risk, never underestimate the risk of company culture. I'm not saying the risk to company culture, I'm saying the risk because of company culture. In most cases, with the exception of maybe one or two, almost every client we've ever supported has a culture risk of a culture mindset of, we've always done it this way. Why do we have to change? We literally had a Department of Defense client at one point say, we've done it this way for the last 30 years. It worked great. Why do we have to change now? And unfortunately, I had to remind them that the laws relating to why you're changing didn't exist 30 years ago, much like GDPR. So the company culture is certainly a risk when you're evaluating risk in itself. And also as a part of company culture, in almost every company, there's going to be somebody within that company who views themselves above the law. Everybody has to follow the policy and procedures except for me. So those guys are a risk, and they're almost always people who've been there forever or friends with the CEO or something like that. So once you've done the risk assessments and a framework comparison, you can get a good idea of the risk as well as the priority and possible quick wins on what you can do to accomplish more to harmonize faster. Always a good idea. And then lastly, for risk assessment, we always suggest, well, we're mostly the third party that performs risk assessments as well for our clients, but we consider, we should suggest that you should consider having a third party perform a risk assessment just so they can have an independent analysis that's external to the company's vision of what risk is. We had a client that can't mention the location or the client obviously, but we had a client that was manufacturing, their manufacturing plant was at the end of a international airport's runway. They did not view the risk as, they did not view the location as a risk. So we simply asked them, what happens when a 737 crashes into your building? They became quickly familiar with the risk. All right, so talking about third parties, from the risk standpoint alone, it's a good idea to have a third party independently audit you. And I'm not talking about an auditor for the purposes of certification. I'm talking about a third party come in, and evaluate your company, where the only people that will see the report or the evaluation is the company itself. We don't really want to go into a certifying audit or some sort of investigative audit without a better understanding of what possible risks are. You really want to bring in external help as soon as you can to help alleviate some of the confusion around risk or whatever that third party may find before a certifying body finds it or before an investigative body finds it. From the regulatory standpoint, this action is actually an audit item in most cases, because you can legitimately say, here's our third party audit. You know, we had an independent party assess our company security posture, things like that. And there you go. You have an audit item that's filled in. Also helps uncover risk unknown to the company. So I gave you an example of that company with the building at the end of the runway that had not considered what would happen if a 737 crashed into their manufacturing plant. But we can also help, by doing this, we can also help improve performance that's internal to the company. Occasionally, as a part of, when Arrakis does independent audits, occasionally we've run across situations where we'll find 3 people doing the job of 1, or maybe 1 person doing the job of 8. And by pointing that out to the company as a part of that independent audit, not only can the company save money, but quite often they can improve performance. Just something to think about. So when we look at maturity models, 27001 expects maturity, but it's not really modeled. They don't really say, if you achieve this level of performance, you're now at XYZ level of maturity. They just assume that you're going to mature with time, but they don't really give you an understanding what the maturity is in 27001. Other frameworks do actually have that. So here we have COVID, where you can go from 0 to hero in 6 steps. And the other ones have maturity models as well. If you're going to implement or harmonize 27001 with another model, then you really need to understand the maturity model of where you're at. Obviously, in most cases, if you are already 27001 certified, you're not going to be a 0. You might be somewhere else along the line, but you're certainly not going to be a 0 if you have a 27001 certificate. So here's NIST. And you can see we have different levels of maturity here, all the way up to optimized. And then here is FFIEC. And again, FFIEC is for banking. It's based on NIST 853, but they have their own set of maturity. I also want to point out in both NIST and FFIEC that you can have different levels of maturity by the category. So you may be very mature when it comes to physical security, but you may not be as mature when it comes to authentication. So there's multiple areas of maturity that you can be in. All right, we're going to talk about this one a lot. Understanding risks for non-compliance. So non-compliance with 27001 could lead to your company being decertified and/or loss of business and revenue. So we really want to avoid that from the 27001 standpoint. Companies spend a lot of money to get ready for a certification audit, And companies spend a lot of money for a certifying body to come in and certify them, do the audit and things like that. We don't really want to put companies at risk in relation to non-compliance. And a company doesn't want to lose their 27,001 anyways. Additionally, from the loss of business or revenue, let's say that there's a contractual requirement to be 27,001 certified or 27,001 compliant. Once you're decertified, technically that's breach of contract. So we have some legal issues that could come out of that. So we don't want to be ever non-compliant. So non-compliant with other frameworks could be a little different though. Could be, so you're not really going to go to jail for not being 27,001 compliant or being decertified, but for other frameworks, you possibly could. So for example, the Uber CISO, there was an issue there. You could Google it, figure it out, but that guy was convicted. He obviously didn't do a very good job. The SolarWinds CISO is on fraud charges right now. That's going to be a big issue. You might notice that the word CISO is in here a lot. Well, in the first two. So if you're a CISO, you might want to consider some sort of legal protection if you're holding that role. When Arrakis fills the virtual CISO role for a company, as a part of our contract, we require legal protection. It's just the way it is. You can be banned for life from the industry you're in. In the FFIEC world, there's been people that have banned for life from the financial community. So imagine going to a university, getting your master's, your PhD or whatever in finance, and you have a cybersecurity job and you screw something up and you get investigated, found guilty, XYZ, doesn't really matter. And then you get banned for life. That would be a significant impact on your entire family. Company decertification. Let's say, for example, you have an ISO 27001, but you also have a CMMC certification. Losing or non-compliance could reduce your ability to do Department of Defense work. Just a scenario. Social negativity is obviously something that that's a big impact. People are still talking about the Target breach from 10 or however many years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. That still affects Target's shares and stock price and so on. People talk about negatively about companies for quite some time. The social negativity in itself, it impacts the advertising budget for a company. Companies now have to spend more money to advertise to overcome the social negativity, and they're probably still losing money for it. You can also have financial penalties. You can be fined. The FTC does fine companies for not doing things the way they should be doing things. PCI environments. I've heard of companies, banks being fined $50,000 a day until something was remediated. And then no matter what regulatory environment, whether you have 27,001 or any other regulatory environment, always understand if you're doing business in the United States or if you have USA customers, USA clients and users, the FTC can be watching you. It is possible. The FTC will go after everyone. They've gone after LinkedIn, or not LinkedIn, Linksys. They've gone after Linksys. They've gone after technology companies. I'm aware of cases where they've gone after a t-shirt company. I'm aware of so many cases. So the FTC is a regulatory body that can go after anybody. And with that, let's do our questions. So I have a set of questions. I can make this thing bigger. Oh my gosh, there's a lot. All right, the first question, how frequently should organizations reassess their cybersecurity maturity level? My suggestion would be at least annually. However, so annually at a minimum. However, if you're going to implement new technologies, so let's say, for example, you did not have PAM, privileged access management, but then you implemented it, you would want to reassess your maturity in that particular area. So I would say at least annually. Question 2, are there specific maturity models that are commonly used or recommended for assessing cybersecurity capabilities within organizations? So within the US, I would say the NIST model or the COBIT model are the top ones. The FFIEC model, that's really just for banking. If you go with NIST, then you're probably going to hit most environments that are in the United States. If you're a COBIT shop, then obviously use COBIT 5 because you're a COBIT shop. But I would be more familiar with NIST if you had to pick one to start with, only because NIST 853 overlaps with so many different areas. And if by some really bad luck you were under FTC purview or they were investigating you for some reason, there's a higher probability that you will be referencing NIST when they talk to you, or they reference NIST when they talk to you. So I would look at that one. Question 3, what are the potential consequences or penalties that organizations may face for failing to comply with 27001 or relevant US relevations? There's numerous potential consequences or penalties, and that's them right there that I just listed. That doesn't mean that's a complete list, but understand people have been convicted, not for 27001 violations, but for other violations. People have been convicted. There's financial charges, financial penalties, things like that. You really want to avoid any sort of investigative situation. And then number 4, how do regulatory enforcement actions or audits affect organizations found to be non-compliant with cybersecurity standards and regulations? How do regulatory enforcement actions or audits affect? So if there is a regulatory enforcement action, the key word is enforcement. An enforcement action is going to be something where that company that was under investigation is going to have to do it, or they're going to face sanctions. And we don't, as a company, we don't want to have to deal with that. So they're basically in a no-win situation. They're going to do it, or they're going to face sanctions. Now, regulatory audits are different. You could have a regulatory audit that produces vulnerabilities or weaknesses or areas of improvement that the regulatory body is going to identify and officially tell you about. They may say, hey, you need to fix this. You have a year, or maybe you have 6 months or whatever. A regulatory enforcement action is going to be more along the lines of, you're going to do it right now. You're going to start right now, and if you can't do it right now, you're going to be fined until you've done it. So there are 2 different viewpoints in this, with regulatory enforcement actions being much more serious. Regulatory audits, that could be viewed as just, hey, we realize you have some deficiencies and you need to fix them, but you did really good in these other areas. All right, number 5, how do you recommend prioritizing compliance efforts when faced with overlapping or conflicting requirements from ISO 27001 and US regulations? I would take a risk-based approach to that and figure out what is going to impact the company negatively the most. That would be how I would prioritize it. I would also look at what is a quick win in relation to what I can do to solve problems faster. Can I work in parallel with some things, or does it have to be a linear progression? But the short answer to that is I would take a risk-based approach to figure out what's going to negatively impact my client more than anything else. And that is the end. And if anybody has any questions or whatever, you want to reach out, there is my email address and the website. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, look for Carl Carpenter. Arrakis Consulting is not one of the things I advertise on LinkedIn, but look for Carl Carpenter. I kind of have a goofy smile, and I'm squinting because it was bright that day. And with that, I thank every single person for joining, and hope to see you guys in the future.